All right. So we're in here. It's been a while. Haven't done one of these in a while. I've been pretty busy, but tonight's show is going to be called uh, the New York Times channels Kolodny's Opiate Hoax. And in December, we did a show called Trump and the GE Passes Kolodny's Opiate Hoax. And we went through Dr. Andrew Kolodny's analysis of, his analysis of what he called the opiate crisis. And we walked through one of his interviews where he's, describing how prescription opiates were driving the so-called opiate crisis. And we had myself, Mr. Mitchell, of course, Dr. William Marquay, and Dr. Jay Joshi on the show. And Dr. Marquay went through the toxicology reports for the most recent drug overdose deaths, which hit another record. And he basically said that the toxicology reports show polysubstance were driving, drug overdose deaths. And there were many drugs in these people's systems. One of the main drugs was fentanyl. And so, one of the questions we raised was, if opioid prescriptions have been cut by 60%, then why are drug overdose deaths still rising? So, the conclusion was that the drug overdose deaths were being driven by habitual drug users who were taking opiates. And then when prescription opiates were cut, they turned to the black market. And so now people are taking drugs on the black market. They're not sure what they're taking, and it's killing people. So previously it may have been heroin users who were driving the drug overdose crisis. Now we're saying mostly fentanyl in the toxicology reports. So it's mostly fentanyl at this point. And before you can get to the bottom of the drug overdose crisis, you have to first diagnose it correctly, and just call it an opiate crisis and blaming opiate manufacturers and suing opiate manufacturers and cutting prescriptions and blaming doctors and not allowing pain patients to get access to proper treatment. It's not helping anybody, because after cutting prescription opiates, castigating doctors and opiate manufacturers and paying patients, guess what? Drug overdose deaths are still rising, and people are still getting high. And now they're taking drugs that on the black market, and nobody knows really what it is, and it's killing people. So, show was real popular. Had several hundred people in the chat room. Apparently, it was so popular that the New York Times wants to channel us. So, the New York Times in June ran an article called "Behind the Scenes: McKinsey Guided Companies at the Center of the Opiate Crisis," and it was written by Chris Hamby and Michael Forsyth. It was printed June 29th, 2022. Sounded oddly similar to our show. So a lot of times when we do these shows, we really don't know who's watching. Sometimes people are watching because they're curious and they want to be informed. Some people are watching for apparently looking for content, like the New York Times. So the New York Times article basically said that in patches of rural Appalachia and the Rust Belt, the health authorities were sounding alarms that a powerful painkiller called Opana had become the drug of choice among people abusing prescription pills. It was twice as potent as OxyContin, the painkiller widely blamed for sparking the opiate crisis, and was relatively easy to dissolve and inject. By 2015, government investigations and scientific publications had linked this misuse to clusters of disease, including a rare and life-threatening blood disorder, an HIV outbreak in Indiana. So the article basically makes it seem like they're talking about McKinsey, because McKinsey was consulting to several opiate manufacturers, and they were sort of advising companies how to increase opiate sales and increase sales of their opiates, whether it was OxyContin or Opana or what have you, and eventually pivoted to Opana. So it goes on to describe what they called Opana patients. And said this, Dr. Stephen Butler, a kidney specialist serving a largely rural stretch of East Tennessee, helped with an unusual case in fall 2012. A woman in her 20s had arrived at the Holston Valley Medical Center in Kingsport with an array of symptoms. She was anemic and her kidneys appeared to be failing. That resembled a rare blood disorder. A few days later, another patient with similar symptoms arrived at the hospital. Then a third. Dr. Butler called the Tennessee Department of Health, which launched an investigation. Over the following months, more patients appeared. As they underwent time-consuming treatment, some acknowledged they had dissolved in injected a pill whose name Dr. Butler had never heard before, Opana ER. So locally became a well-described phenomenon, he recalled. They were just called Opana patients as though that was a real common thing. So we know that in Tennessee, in Appalachia, Opana was particularly abused in those areas. So, and also in the article, they show someone cooking Opana on a stove in West Virginia. So how the people were, snorting Opana and crushing it and also cooking it and taking it intravenously and getting sick from it. And they show how people were cooking it on a stove in West Virginia. So the article made it seem like it was about McKinsey, and then it pivoted to Opana. And it sounded oddly similar to our show where we talked about Endo and Opana. And I'm going to try to share my screen with Mr. Mitchell again talking about Endo International.
Where is the money flowing into? And I think that that's the question that incentivizes this continued criminalization of physicians, of even, albeit, biopharma companies, although, those are the last folks that probably need any defending from the public, right? But, unfortunately, you have to look at what's right is right. That who's standing on a side, and to me, a clear line in the sand has been drawn. Like, for example, we talk about Endo a lot on this show. Endo was one of the first, actually the only biopharma company that took their opioid drug, Aparna, off the shelves before litigation started. So when they took it off the shelf in 2017. In other words, they've continually get swept up in this criminalization. And I think the question that has to be asked is who's benefiting from this continued oversimplification? If the drug manufacturers have complied really since 2019, 2020, everyone has taken off their opioid drugs or significantly cut the supply, yet the crackdowns by the DEA, ATF, and the other alphabet law enforcement agencies continue to increase. Who is benefiting? Who is materially benefiting? We know it's not the patients, because we're reading about their deaths in the newspaper every day. We know that it's not we know it's not even the folks that choose to be dependent, even versus addicts, right? Because if I'm a drug dealer, I would be concerned about my supply, because just like any other business, whether illicit or otherwise, the way that you continue to be successful in business is to have repeat customers. So if my customers keep dropping dead, then that means I got to constantly find new customers. So even as a drug dealer, as counterintuitive as that sounds, I don't necessarily materially benefit in the same way if I want to continue to get repeat customers. So the question, again, just kind of framing it, who is materially benefiting here from this continued criminalization of opioids?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on a 20,000 foot level, I mean, people I've spoken to say it's really wealthy, upper middle class and wealthy people whose children have maybe become addicted, OD'd on opiates, and they want on maybe heroin or something else, and want to blame the opiate manufacturer because it's maybe more. It's less embarrassing to say my son or daughter OD'd on opiates or was addicted to opiates after being prescribed opiates and then turned to heroin or heroin laced with fentanyl than to say my son or daughter's a heroin addict. And in the case of Opana, Opana actually had medicinal purposes, and it was effective for people with pain, and more effective in some ways than maybe Lidoderm or Vicodin or OxyContin or Percocet or hydrocodone. But there were people who were crushing it and snorting it and also cooking it and boiling it down and taking it intravenously and getting sick from it. And they wanted to blame the manufacturer because it wasn't crush proof enough.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So it's almost like there's no responsibility for people who are taking opiates and maybe become addicted to opiates, and maybe opiates that weren't even prescribed to them. That doesn't, crushing Opana doesn't sound like a pain patient. It sounds like a drug, someone who wants to do drugs. Cooking Opana, if you're in pain, you don't have time to cook Opana and take it intravenously. You know what I'm saying? That sounds like a drug addict. It doesn't sound like that's like drug seeking behavior. It doesn't sound like a pain patient. And so the people who are for some reason crushing Opana and snorting it, or cooking Opana and taking it intravenously, are not held accountable in the same way that people who were taking crack in the 80s or 90s. So okay, so that's basically our analysis of endo and Opana's impact in certain areas, and the fact that people were crushing and snorting and taking it intravenously and getting sick from it. And Chris Hamby and Michael Forsyth basically repeated the exact same analysis. So clearly they're big fans of Trump and the GE. The other interesting thing is that their article came out in June, and it was well known that amid the opiate crisis that upon its impact in Tennessee and in Appalachia. So why all of a sudden in June 2022 they want to write about Opana and endo as if it was a revelation? So it seems like they're trying to supersede us, and they made it seem like they've done all this analysis on the opiate crisis, so-called opiate crisis. So they seem like they're real late on endo and Opana. So describing how people were cooking Opana and so on and so forth is real late in June 2022. So they repeated practically what we said verbatim. And we wish they would have cited the source. So obviously they're big fans of Trump and the GE. We're flattered. But, just from around our subscribers and our viewers, that we put out heat and we put out information that you can't get in the corporate media. So we're flattered that the New York Times wants to channel us and wants to repeat our content and probably try to supersede us. But, we're just pointing out that that show was epic, and apparently Chris Hamby and Michael Forsyth think so as well. So that's basically it. You keep listening. We'll keep giving you information that you can't get other places, and we'll keep putting out heat. So that's the New York Times channel's Kolodny's Opioid Hoax. Thank you.